My name is Zachary Hoskins. I'm a writer. I am so glad to be here at Come 30. My presentation today is called Come As You Are, Alternative Rock, and the Artist Formerly Known as Prince. So when I heard about this symposium, sorry, I'm trying to figure out a way to read my notes here. When I heard about this symposium, this was the topic that came to mind because I've always thought of Come as Prince's alternative rock album. And I know that that might sound strange. A lot of people would say chaos and disorder, but for me, it's Come. So I realize this needs some unpacking. So let me start by trying to explain why I feel this way. And to do that, we need to first explain, or at least try to explain, what alternative rock is, which is easier said than done. Alternative is a vaguely defined category by nature since it requires the existence of another category, a mainstream or conventional form of rock, to give it meaning. This symbiotic relationship with the mainstream also creates a built-in tension, since the more invested one is in the idea of an alternative music culture, the more resistant one will be to imposing a strict definition on it, especially when that definition is coming from a perceived authority figure like a rock journalist, or worse, a record executive or radio programmer. For our purposes, though, here's a quick historical rundown and just a caveat for the international lovers in the audience. Because both Prince and I are American, this is going to be a US-centric version of the history, but I think there are some parallels. So the punk movement in the late 1970s spawned a proliferation of subgenres with their own subcultures, venues, and independent means of promotion and distribution outside of the mainstream music industry. What's confusing, but will become important as we go through this presentation, is that some of those subgenres were very clearly descended from punk, that is, raw, guitar-oriented, and aggressive, but not all. The commonality was less sonic and more in a shared hostility to, or at minimum, disinterest in, the standards of mainstream commercial success. These subgenres continued to take root throughout the 1980s, when they were more commonly given the collective label of indie rock, referring to the aforementioned independent means of promotion and distribution, or college rock, since, at least in the States, those means of promotion and distribution were largely tied to college radio stations. Relevant to our interests, the Twin Cities were a particular hotbed of indie rock activities in the 1980s, with groups like The Replacements, Husker Du, and Soul Asylum forming their own underground counterpart to the Minneapolis sound.
Right.
Alternative rock, as we know it, officially entered the American mainstream and became even more confusing as a category in 1991 with three major milestones. The first was the release of R.E.M's Out of Time, their second major label album and the first by an alternative group to hit #1 on the pop charts. The second was the inaugural Lollapalooza tour, which became the highest grossing tour in North America that summer. And finally, the third was the release of Nirvana's Nevermind, which went platinum in November and symbolically knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous from the #1 spot early the following year. And the poster here is from 1991, the year punk broke. It's a documentary by Dave Markey of the summer 1991 European tour by Sonic Youth and Nirvana. And in true alternative form, that title started out as a self-deprecating in-joke during the tour, but ended up coming true and becoming this very, great way to encapsulate what happened in 1991. Okay, so that's the crash course on alternative rock. Now let's talk about what that has to do with Come. I want to start by saying we're mostly going by vibes here, which is appropriate because as I think I've demonstrated, alternative is a genre built on pretty much nothing but vibes. So first we have the album cover, which is especially striking when you contrast it, as I did here, with the covers for Prince's previous two albums, 1991's Diamonds and Pearls and 1992's Love Symbol album. The presentation of those two albums very clearly reflected the content, which was, broadly speaking, hip-hop inflected R&B with mainstream pop appeal. They're bright and colorful, with a lot of gold in the color palette, the early 90s, of course, being Prince's gold era. And then we have Come, which is this stark monochrome image. A lot of reviews at the time called it funereal. In fact, in the liner notes, J.C. Munson is literally credited for funeral art direction. I think Gothic is also a watchword, goth being one of those many post-punk genres that were eventually folded into the alternative umbrella. And of course, here, when we say Gothic, we mean this both figuratively, in that it looks like the kind of cover photo you'd see on a Sisters of Mercy album, and literally, in that it's taken in front of the Sagrada Familia, an actual Gothic church. The next alt rock vibe I want to point out are the song titles, which are famously kept to just one word, sometimes to a slightly excessive degree, as in the case of Let It Go. Obviously, alternative rock didn't invent one word titles, but this is a convention I associate especially with grunge, which tended towards terse single words or short phrases. For example, here's the track list of Pearl Jam's second studio album, 1993's Versus, which uses one word titles for 10 of its 12 tracks, including one, Rearview Mirror, that uses the exact same cheat Prince used for Let It Go. uh, Moving beyond the album's presentation, there's a lyrical darkness to several of the songs that feels of a piece with the bleak, alienated perspective of many alternative rockers. This can be seen most prominently in Papa, with its unsettling depiction of apparently autobiographical child abuse, but it's also there in the fetishistic imagery of pheromone. And this is I debated including this in the presentation. It's a little morbid, but speaking of darkness, it's worth noting that the album came out mere months after the suicide of Nirvana's Kurt Cobain and the death by overdose of Hole's Kristen Pfaff. As such, it's possible to read into the aforementioned funeral imagery with Prince's birth and symbolic death dates printed on the sleeve some of the nihilism and self-negation that pervaded the alternative scene at the time. I should probably mention at this point that Come doesn't necessarily sound like an alternative rock album, at least not in the guitar heavy grunge sense of the word that I think we all usually think of. The closest the album gets to that is Papa, which has the heavy chorus pedal and loud, quiet, loud dynamic popularized most famously by Nirvana. By and large, though, this is a very sonically diverse album. The horn-laced funk of both the title track and Race wouldn't sound too out of place on Love Symbol. In fact, Race at least was recorded during the sessions for Love Symbol. Let It Go sounds like Prince's best stab at G-Funk. Dark is vintage Southern soul. Solo is some kind of heretofore unknown combination of blues and opera. But going back to the hazy definition of alternative, not everything we might discover as that we might describe as alternative rock is grunge, or even, for that matter, rock. I hear a lot of the emergent trip hop pioneered in the late 80s and early 90s by English electronic groups like Portishead and Massive Attack in space. The harder edged Pheromone and Loose, meanwhile, seem sonically indebted to the industrial rock of artists like Nine Inch Nails. And I saw Casey Rain mention this in the panel yesterday morning. More than anything, though, what I hear in Come is an indifference to commercial standards that is in itself very alternative. The album may have spawned two not hit singles, Let It Go and Space. Neither of them were hits. And at least to me, they also are by no means the most interesting tracks on the album. I think it's also important to keep in mind, and I'm gonna start this this video here with the music not on, and just kind of talk over it. I think it's important to keep in mind that Come was just one of several projects being worked on at the same time. And I think if we're going to talk about Prince as a 90s alternative rocker, we have to at least mention The Undertaker. So this was a live in the studio album that Prince recorded, or I guess the artist formerly known as Prince at the time recorded as a Nirvana-style trio with bassist Sonny Thompson and drummer Michael Bland in mid-1993. It was eventually released as a home video project in 1995. And I think you can see here, hopefully, the video picks up on Come's dark, edgy aesthetic. The whole performance is shot from the perspective of a groupie played by actress Vanessa Marcil, who wanders onto the Paisley Park soundstage after overdosing on pills. So very, very gritty indeed. But the music itself is some of the rawest and heaviest rock guitar Prince ever recorded, captured in a single take with no overdubs. I would say it's sadly the closest we'll ever come to hearing a Prince album recorded by the late alternative rock anti-producer Steve Albini. So I'm going to let this play a little longer in the background. I've been making a lot of connections between Come, its associated projects, and alternative rock, but I obviously can't point to any hard evidence that this was Prince's intention. There are, however, some interesting stories floating around that suggest the alternative scene was, if nothing else, very much on his radar in the early 90s. First, as Casey Rain mentioned yesterday, Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails said that Prince was a big fan of their 1992 EP Broken. He also said some other stuff in that same interview that I'll get to in a little bit. Second, I came across a random 2018 interview from the current Minneapolis Public Radio with Smashing Pumpkins' Billy Corgan, who said that not only was Prince a fan of their 1995 song, 1979, but he also used to sit in with the Pumpkins when they played 7th Street Entry, the smaller punk club adjacent to First Avenue in Minneapolis before they were famous. Third, Jim Walsh of the St. Paul Pioneer Press reported on a party at Paisley Park on Valentine's Day 1994 to commemorate the release of The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, the guest list for which included members of Soul Asylum and the Gin Blossoms, who are admittedly not the most credible alternative act, but they were on the Reality Bites soundtrack, so we'll give them a pass. I think the aggregate of these stories, and I'm sure there are others I didn't get around to mentioning, suggests that he knew what he was doing when he flirted with an alternative aesthetic on Come. Of course, he'd also done this kind of thing before. It's been well documented that Prince's long-term strategy for the crossover success he'd eventually achieved with Purple Rain began by branding himself as a new wave artist, beginning with 1980's Dirty Mind. I don't have time to get into the specifics here, but this article I found on JSTOR looks pretty good. In 1994, of course, crossover success wasn't the artist then formerly known as Prince's goal. He was trying to get out of the mainstream. So it makes sense that he would try to do so by embracing, in his own idiosyncratic way, a musical subculture whose only coherent definition was its resistance to the mainstream. There's a kind of poetic symmetry between Dirty Mind and Come that I don't think I fully realized until I worked on this presentation, right down to the similar visual composition of their respective album covers. Of course, the main difference between Prince's new wave gambit in the early 80s and his attempt to do the same thing in reverse with alternative in the early 90s is that the first one worked and the second one didn't. Prince was an important influence on a variety of alternative artists. This is his entry in 1995 Spin Alternative Record Guide, which is one of the earliest attempts at creating a critical canon with a post-punk sensibility. You'll notice, among other things, that they rated Come a very respectable 8 out of 10. But while other influential artists at the time were more openly embraced by members of the alternative nation, see, for example, the high-profile collaborations between Pearl Jam and Neil Young, or Nine Inch Nails and David Bowie, the artist formerly known as Prince was held at arm's length. This despite the fact that changing one's name to an unpronounceable glyph to get out a recording contract is just factually the most punk rock thing a human being can possibly do. As part of my research for this presentation, I read an entire anthology of writing on alternative rock by the critic Jim DeRogatis. He mentions Prince exactly 2 times in this book, once as a throwaway reference in an article about the alternative hip-hop group PM Dawn, and once in this paragraph from his snarky roundup of the best and worst of 1994. He writes, "The man who once was Prince showed that he has well and truly lost his marbles, accusing Warner Brothers of institutionalized slavery at the same time that he was pulling the insulting scam of ridding out his contract with the label by cleaning out his closet." Meanwhile, I mentioned Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails earlier. The full story he told about his encounter with the artist, likely in 1993, is even more revealing. He told Gina Morris of the UK indie rock magazine Select, "I'll tell you a funny story about Prince. I was in the studio and I heard Prince was coming in. There was a time when I thought he was awesome, but what a fucking creep. The rules were you were never to say the word Prince. You had to write down that symbol. You were never to look at him or talk to him unless he approached you first. Shit like that." He goes on to describe the artist walking past him in the studio hallway without saying a word, concluding, "I couldn't believe it. I don't care who you are. That's bullshit." So this is the part of the presentation I've been grappling with for the last few weeks. On the one hand, it's deeply ironic, both as a Prince fan and as someone with the benefit of 30 years of hindsight, to read these dismissive reactions to the name change and Warner Brothers battle from people who were at least nominally invested in the idea of an alternative culture, especially DeRogatis, who used up an awful lot of ink in the 90s complaining about how Pearl Jam were the only high-profile alternative group to take a principled stand against the music industry with their boycott of Ticketmaster. I kept reading this book thinking Prince was literally right there. And especially after Camilla's and Crystal's presentations in the last session, I also want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. A very big part of the reason why Prince wasn't accorded the same respect as other alternative rock progenitors was because of his race. I would be remiss not to acknowledge the fact that basically every alternative and indie scene in the 1990s and 80s was overwhelmingly white. But on the other hand, I also want to give some credit to 90s alternative rock as arguably the last time we had an explicitly anti-capitalist voice in mainstream music culture. And if you put yourself in the shoes of someone from the alternative scene, which in 1994 was being systemically strip mined by capitalist cool merchants, this skepticism toward Prince makes at least a little more sense. In 1994, the artist formerly known as Prince had been a major pop star for a full decade. About a year and a half before Come was released, he was all over the news for signing the largest recording deal in history. This is how that signing was reported in Spin magazine in November 1992. Interestingly, on the same news page that also featured a story about Nine Inch Nails' own record company struggles and another one about Nirvana being sued for copyright infringement by the post-punk band Killing Joke. So the article, it says Prince crowned king. The article says, what do Prince and Dan Quayle have in common besides being champions of family values? I think that's supposed to be sarcastic. They're both vice presidents. In a renegotiated deal with Warner Brothers, his Purple Mountain Majesty has been made VP of the mega company. He even gets a Los Angeles office to complement his estimated $108 million funding agreement. Eat your hearts and wallets out, measly Madonna and minuscule Michael. This is the grandest music contract ever inked. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of snark there, but I will say in the defense of this writer and of the general attitude toward Prince at the time, if you're playing basement shows on the indie rock scene, you're not going to read that article and think of Prince as a fellow traveler, no matter how many moody black and white photos he includes with his next album. So ideally, this is the part of the presentation where I wrap everything up into a neat little argument. I will regret to say this is not going to happen today. But I would like to end by at least giving some sense of why this matters to me and why I think it should matter at least a little bit to the rest of us. When I talk about Prince in New Wave or Prince in alternative rock, it can sometimes seem like I'm trying to legitimize him via inclusion in these categories. For the record, I don't think Prince needs to be legitimized through his proximity to alternative rock. I do think, however, that movements give visibility and legibility to artists. And as someone who is a rare bona fide original, Prince rarely gets to benefit from that legibility. One of the things that struck me the most about the Spin Alternative Record Guide entry on Prince that I showed earlier is the following passage, which I'll just read. It describes Prince as an arrogant, self-absorbed Picasso playing with form, not as a social actor. Sure, as Madonna's partner in the 80s deconstruction of the rock god, as a player in the fields of race, sexuality, belief, and the meaning of the blues, Prince's pop had consequence. But ultimately, unlike most music in this book, it will endure as something detached from context, the master's line. I think part of what we're doing at these symposia, and part of why I think what we're doing is important, is illustrating exactly how Prince was not detached from context. His work connected to all kinds of things, which we've seen in all of the various presentations these past 2 days, to the Black intellectual tradition, to both contemporaneous and ongoing discourses on race, sexuality, and spirituality, to the exploitative business of the music industry itself. I believe that connecting him to alternative rock, like I'm doing, or to hip hop, like I'm so disappointed that India isn't here because I thought it was going to be such a perfect confluence. Like I'm talking about Come as alternative rock, she's talking about it as hip hop. It is equally both of those things. So I'll just say that spiritually, she's here, and I totally get the point that she was trying to make. But making these connections helps to make these contexts legible in a way that treating him as a solitary idiosyncratic genius clearly has not. More than anything, I think the era of Prince's music that he kickstarted with Come in 1994 is ripe for rediscovery and recontextualization. And I was a little unsure if I wanted to talk about this, partly because of time, but I'm running a little ahead. So I will say, I logged into Facebook today for the first time I log in maybe once a week, and I happened to come across an exchange between Miles Marshall Lewis and the music writer Chuck Eddy, and it kind of some of the things Miles was telling Chuck about this symposium and the way that Chuck responded kind of made me feel some type of way. He basically implied that this was, that he's a critic and he doesn't care about hero worship, and he cares about, he's sort of above all that was sort of the implication. And it seemed a little dismissive of what we're doing here, as if we're just kind of, like a fan convention, and we're just talking about how great Prince was and everything is perfect. And I really fundamentally don't think that that's what we're doing. I think that what we're doing is criticism, is music criticism, and recontextualizing albums that were overlooked at the time because of all kinds of blinders, racial blinders, genre blinders, all kinds of ways that Prince was overlooked in the 90s and doesn't need to be now. I think it's extremely important work, and it's not just, fan nostalgizing. So, so much of, and this is where I'll end, so much of the critical narrative on the artist formerly known as Prince in the 90s is rooted in this idea of decline because he was no longer in the mainstream. And so this is one reason why I think alternative rock is a fruitful point of comparison for him. Because in alternative and indie rock, not being part of the mainstream is the whole point. Mainstream success is something to be avoided, not something to be embraced. And so by looking at Come not as a commercial failure, commercial and critical failure for that matter, but as a rebirth of Prince as an independent recording artist, I think we now have the opportunity to give this music, which is phenomenal, the context and consideration it deserves. So that's where I'll end it. And yeah, thank you very much.